Hello everyone and welcome to CJMeds. In today's video, I am going to discuss about the thalamus and its nucleus. Before starting this video, I want you guys to remember some things like thalamus is a relay station and its basic function is to relay three types of information: the limbic system information, the sensory information, and the motor information. The thalamus takes all that information and sends it to the cerebral cortex. Now let's start one by one and take a look on how thalamus perform these functions and send the information from these structures to the cortex. Before that, if you are new to my channel or if you haven't subscribed till now, then please do hit that subscribe button, and if you find this video informative, give a like to it and comment your views. Now let's get started with the first one, the limbic thalamic nuclei. That is the nuclei of thalamus which are involved in the limbic system. These nuclei are divided by internal medullary lamina into three groups. Here we have three types of nuclei: anterior thalamic nuclei, medial dorsal nucleus, which is also called as dorsal medial nucleus, and the centromedian nucleus. Let's get started with the anterior thalamic nucleus. The basic thing I want you all to remember is that this nucleus is involved in a special type of circuit called as Papez circuit. It is important because the Papez circuit is involved in the episodic memory, but particularly the emotional type of episodic memory. So if there is damage to this Papez circuit, it will damage the emotional episodic memory and cause certain diseases. It can be diseases like the Alzheimer's, because we already know that Alzheimer is a disease related to memory aspect. The other one is Parkinson's disease, and there is one more called as the Korsakoff syndrome. It is usually seen in alcoholics and is due to thiamine deficiency. So remember, the anterior thalamic nucleus is involved in the Papez circuit, that is the emotional aspect of episodic memory, and if this pathway is damaged, then it can result into Alzheimer's, Parkinson's and Korsakoff syndrome. Now let's take a look into this Papez circuit. I have already made a video in which I have discussed the Papez circuit. Here I will explain it again. Let's see what happens here. It starts with a very important structure, the hippocampus. Remember, hippocampus is a very important structure involved with our memory. The fornix takes information from the hippocampus and synapses with the mammillary bodies. Then the neurons in the mammillary bodies, they send their fibers to the anterior thalamic nuclei through the mammillothalamic tract. Then the axons of the anterior thalamic nuclei go to the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus, which is another important component of the limbic system, sends its axons to the entorhinal cortex and stimulates it. And then neurons of entorhinal cortex further connect with the hippocampus. So this completes the circuit. And remember, the whole purpose of this circuit is emotional episodic memory. This was all about the anterior thalamic nuclei. Now let's move towards the mediodorsal or the dorsomedial nucleus. Here we need to know three important things. It is obviously involved in emotional memory. Then it's involved in motivation. And it's also involved in your overall drive. Okay, so it's involved in emotional memory, motivation and drive. So whenever there is damage to this nucleus, it can damage these functions and can result in personality changes. And the disease which affect these areas of the thalamus is the Korsakoff syndrome. So whenever someone has a severe thiamine deficiency, it can affect the Papez circuit and also the dorsal medial nucleus. So now let's talk about the structures which are connected with the mediodorsal nucleus. So remember that the mediodorsal nucleus receives three inputs or three different afferents. One, from the olfactory cortex. It will send its information to the mediodorsal nucleus. Second, the amygdala, which is very important component of the limbic system because it is involved in fear, anxiety and aggression. It will also send its information to the mediodorsal nucleus. And then third, the hypothalamus also sends its information to the mediodorsal nucleus. Remember, these three structures which are sending these afferents or inputs to the mediodorsal nucleus or the dorsomedial nucleus. So once this nucleus receives all this information, it takes that information about the emotion, motivation, drive and aggression and sends it to the prefrontal cortex in the cerebral hemisphere. Let's do a recap. The inputs are olfactory cortex, amygdala and hypothalamus. And then the output is to the prefrontal cortex. That's our mediodorsal nucleus or the dorsomedial nucleus. Now let's discuss about the last limbic system nucleus, that is the centromedian nucleus. Remember that this one is a interlaminar nucleus. That means it is present in our intermedullary lamina. So the centromedian nucleus receives information from the slow pain pathways, and we all know that the pain pathways are the spinothalamic tract and the fibers which carry the pain stimulus are the C fibers. So let's say we have a pain stimulus here which is carried via the C fibers to the posterior grey horn. After the posterior grey horn, they cross over and move towards the spinal lemniscus. The spinal lemniscus gives up some of the collaterals to the reticular formation and then eventually snaps in the centromedian nucleus. And some of the fibers from the reticular formation may also give some information to the centromedian nucleus. Whenever the centromedian nucleus receives information, particularly from the pain information, it sends it to the non-specific cortical areas. It means we don't really know the exact area where these fibers go in the cerebral cortex. It is believed that it sends it to the cingulate gyrus. This is important because the centromedian nucleus converts this pain stimulus into emotions with the involvement of cingulate gyrus. And hence technically this centromedian nucleus is also believed to be involved in emotional aspect of pain. Alright, so we have covered the limbic involvement of thalamus, the anterior thalamic nucleus, the mediodorsal nucleus and the centromedian nucleus. Now let's move on towards the sensory thalamic nuclei. All the nuclei which are present here are the part of lateral nuclear group of thalamus. We divide the lateral nuclear group into two parts, the ventral part and the dorsal part. You can also call it as the anterior and posterior part. So in the ventral part, we have the first nucleus called as ventero-anterior nucleus. One is ventrolateral nucleus. Next one we have here is the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus. And the last one we have in our ventral group is the ventero-posterior medial nucleus. Only two nuclei from here are involved in the sensory activity. They are the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus and the ventero-posterior medial nucleus. The other one are motor nucleus. The nucleus in the dorsal part of lateral nuclear group is called the pulvinar nucleus. The thalamus has two more nucleus coming from the backside. One is in the lateral part and other one is in the medial part. They are also involved in the sensory function. These two nuclei are medial geniculate nucleus and lateral geniculate nucleus. So now we have 5 nucleus which are involved in sensory function. Let's discuss them one by one. Let's start with the lateral geniculate nucleus. Basic thing to remember is that lateral geniculate nucleus is involved in the visual pathway or vision. To remember this, you can use a little trick here. It is that the lateral geniculate nucleus, the L for lateral can be remembered as L for light. So light equals vision. So the visual stimulus coming to us hit the retina in our eyes. The retina will become activated and send impulse down to the optic nerve. The optic nerve carries those impulses to the lateral geniculate nucleus through the optic tract. The lateral geniculate nucleus will take that information and send it to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex is referred to as the Brodmann area 17. So remember that lateral geniculate nucleus helps in the visual pathway to reach the brain so that we can have perception of vision. Let's move on to the next nucleus, the medial geniculate nucleus. Now the medial geniculate nucleus is involved in the auditory pathway, that is in hearing. To remember this, M for medial can be taken as M for music. So light for lateral geniculate nucleus and music for medial geniculate nucleus to remember their functions. Starting with the vestibulocochlear nerve, which carries the information from the inner ear via the cranial nerve 8 and synapses on the cochlear nuclei in the pons medulla junction. From the cochlear nuclei, these fibers cross over and form structure called the trapezoid body. After this, they send these fibers with the help of a tract called the lateral lemniscus. Now this lateral lemniscus will synapse on the inferior colliculus, which is located in midbrain. The inferior colliculus will receive this information of auditory stimulus and send them to the medial geniculate nucleus of thalamus. The medial geniculate nucleus will then send its radiations to the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. It is Broadband area 41 and 42. Great. With this, we have completed the discussion of medial geniculate nucleus. Now let's move towards the next sensory nucleus of thalamus, the pulvinar nucleus. It receives information from medial geniculate nucleus and lateral geniculate nucleus, superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. The medial geniculate nucleus for auditory pathway, the lateral geniculate nucleus for visual pathway, the superior colliculus for reflex head movements from visual stimulus, and the inferior colliculus for reflex head movements with response to auditory stimulus. So the pulvinar nucleus receives both auditory and visual stimulus. It takes that information and sends it to the visual association area in the occipital lobe. So we can say that the pulvinar nucleus is involved in visual processing. That means it helps us to see someone's face, then recognize it from the past and give meaning to it. That is the job of the pulvinar nucleus. Now let's discuss about the next one, the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus. Remember that it receives sensory information from the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, which is involved in proprioception, that is fine touch, vibration, etc. And the other sensory information comes from the spinothalamic tract, which has two parts, the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract. The lateral portion is involved in pain and temperature, and anterior is involved in crude touch and pressure. So as I said, it receives information about pain, temperature, crude touch, pressure, which is carried through the spinothalamic tract, which sends this information to the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus. And there are also fine touch, proprioception and vibrations carried by the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway that sends it to the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus. Now the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus sends this information to the primary somatosensory cortex, which is broadband area 3, 1 and 2. With this, we have completed the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus. Now let's discuss about the ventero-posterior medial nucleus. There are two primary sensations that the ventero-posterior medial nucleus receives. One, it receives information from the trigeminothalamic tract. The trigeminothalamic tract picks up information from the face about the pain, temperature, proprioception, all of that information of the face. The other type of sensation that it picks up is gustation. Gustation is taste sense. So two types of sense, taste and pain, temperature, proprioception from the face. All these facial sensations are carried via the trigeminal nerve. These sensations are given to different cranial nerve nuclei like the mesencephalic, principal pontine and spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Then these nuclei give their efferents that synapse on the ventero-posterior medial nucleus through the trigeminothalamic tract. The taste sensations that are carried by cranial nerve 7, that is anterior 2/3 of the tongue, cranial nerve 9, that is glossopharyngeal nerve, that is posterior 2/3 of the tongue, and a little bit from the vagus nerve, that is cranial nerve 10. All of this information from these cranial nerves terminate on the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Then from this nucleus of tractus solitarius, it sends fibers called the central tegmental tract, which goes from nucleus of tractus solitarius and synapse on the ventero-posterior medial nucleus. And from here, this information goes to the primary somatosensory cortex, which is broadband area 3, 1 and 2. Alright, now we are left with the last two motor thalamic nuclei of the thalamus, that are the ventero-anterior nucleus and the ventrolateral nucleus. Let's start with the ventero-anterior nucleus. It receives input from one particular structure, the basal ganglia. I have already made a separate video on basal ganglia, discussing about the different nuclei which are present in the basal ganglia. Make sure to watch it. The link is in the description. What I want you to remember is that it receives information from the basal ganglia and sends it back to the cerebral cortex. The whole purpose of this is that it plays an important role in initiating and planning of motor movements. The motor cortex sends its basic motor plan to the basal ganglia. It can synapse on different nuclei in the basal ganglia, like the putamen, from the putamen to the globus pallidus internus, and then it may go to synapse on the thalamus, the ventral anterior nucleus of thalamus, which sends it back to the cortex. This pathway we discussed now is called as the direct pathway, which is designed to amplify the motor movements. Another thing that can happen is the motor plan from the cortex comes to the basal ganglia and synapses on the putamen. That can go to globus pallidus externus. From globus pallidus externus, it can go to the subthalamus. From subthalamus, it can go to the globus pallidus internus. And from there, it goes to the ventral anterior nucleus of thalamus and back up to the cerebral cortex. This pathway is called the indirect pathway, which is designed to slow down the already planned motor movement. These direct and indirect pathways are very important for the functioning of correct motor movements. I have discussed these pathways very deeply in a separate video. You will find the link to that video in the description. Okay, so what is important to understand here is that the cerebral cortex sends a motor plan to the basal ganglia, which modifies the motor plan and sends it to the thalamus, and the thalamus then sends it back to the cortex. Now we have the perfect motor movement that we have planned, and we will initiate it. Now the area of cortex which receives this information is the premotor cortex, which is Brodmann area 6. Alright, we have completed the ventral anterior nucleus. Now we are left with the last nucleus called the ventral lateral nucleus. Remember that the ventral lateral nucleus has two types of function. One, that it plays a role in coordination of motor movements, and second, modulation of motor movements, particularly the planning and initiation of the movement. There are two inputs coming to the ventral lateral nucleus. So the motor cortex sends its motor plan to the basal ganglia, which then send it to the ventral lateral nucleus by doing some modulation, by decreasing it or amplifying it. We already discussed this in the previous nucleus. What is important here is that the motor cortex is sending its motor plan to the cerebellum also. We know that cerebellum is involved in coordination of motor movements. It is involved in tone. It is also involved in posture. The cerebellum also receives information about proprioception. What is proprioception? It is the position of the muscle, tendons, joints and your ligaments. So the cerebellum knows where our muscles, our tendons, our joints are in this three-dimensional space. Then it receives information from the cerebral cortex about the planned motor movement. It also receives information from the inner ear, which is about our equilibrium. So imagine now, the cerebellum knows everything about proprioception, equilibrium and also about what the brain is planning. So it makes a perfect blueprint of the plan for the best type of movement which is necessary there. The cerebellum sends this perfect blueprint to the ventral lateral nucleus, and it also sends it to the red nucleus. And then the red nucleus also synapses with the ventral lateral nucleus. And remember here an important thing, that the nucleus of cerebellum which sends this information to the thalamus is the dentate nucleus. Now the ventral lateral nucleus sends this information back to the cortex, to a special area of cortex called the primary motor cortex, which is Brodmann area number 4. So a quick recap here. The ventral lateral nucleus receives information about modulation from the basal ganglia and also receives information about the perfect motor plan from the cerebellum and sends it to the cortex. Alright, so with this we have completed the topic. We covered the different thalamic nuclei and their connections. Make sure to like my video, comment your views in the comment section and don't forget to subscribe to my channel CJMates. See you in the next video. Till then, take care, stay safe. Thanks for watching.